Welcome. My name is Reich Longest. I am the co-director of the Duke Environmental Law and Policy Clinic, one of the sponsoring organizations for this event. We're so glad to have you here today. I'm going to go ahead and begin the introductions for today. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Adrienne Hollis. Dr. Hollis is a senior climate justice and health scientist at the Union of Concerned Scientists. She has more than 20 years of extensive experience in the environmental arena, particularly focused on environmental justice, equity, and inclusion, as well as the adverse health effects of environmental exposures and climate change on vulnerable communities. As an advocate, associate professor, environmental toxicologist, and environmental attorney. And I will also add, as one of the favorite people that I have to follow on Twitter. So if you're not one of her Twitter followers, you need to get in that group. I would like to offer the floor now to Dr. Hollis to take it away to introduce the rest of our speakers for today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for attending this symposium event on navigating the now, resources and strategies during this pandemic. So I'd first like to thank Duke Environmental Law and Policy Clinic for this invitation, but I also want to acknowledge the organizers. This series is presented by Howard Law School and the Duke Environmental Law and Policy Clinic, and sponsored by Vermont Law School, Shaw University, and the Yale School of Forestry and the Environment. So let us begin. In the United States, systemic racism against Black and Brown people affects every aspect of our lives, from education to employment, from housing to healthcare, from the food we eat to the air we breathe. And these same communities are affected by environmental contamination, climate change, and most recently, COVID-19. So what we now have is a syndemic, a set of linked health problems that interact and compound each other's effects. COVID-19, structural racism, environmental injustice, and climate change, any of these on their own are deadly, but together their results are catastrophic. Before we can even begin to address any of these issues successfully, however, there is a great deal of information that we need in order to be successful. So I'm excited to introduce two fantastic speakers to you today. The first speaker is Yvette Arellano, an experienced environmental justice advocate and researcher. Most recently, they are the founder and director of an environmental justice organization, Fence Line Watch, of people building a broad movement to effect positive change by holding the fossil fuel industry accountable to the communities it disproportionately affects on the fence line. They understand the importance of a multi-pronged approach. Currently, Yvette is leading efforts in Houston, home of the largest petrochemical complex in the nation, to help the city's most vulnerable communities on the petrochemical expansion fueled by plastic production and language justice. Our second speaker, Kayla DeVault-Went, is enrolled Shawnee and Anishinaabe and is an engineer in the Commission Corps while finishing a master's in public health with George Washington University. She previously graduated from Arizona State University with a master's in American Indian Studies, focusing on the intersections of engineering, housing, sustainability, policy, and indigenous paradigms. She has served in past youth delegations regarding climate and indigenous rights, including COP, human rights at the United Nations, and World Bank negotiations. Her particular focus in environmental rights and climate discussions is around indigenous sovereignty and visibility, dismantling Native American stereotypes, the rights of nature, intersectionality, and how to authentically engage in all stakeholders in the climate movement, including those in the non-renewable energy force. On that note, I'm going to turn the mic over to Yvette.
Good afternoon and good morning to some folks. I I want to start off by really giving broad strokes of environmental justice so that folks can understand some of the terminology and some of the language that I'm going to be sharing with you today. So I'm going to do a quick sharing of my screen. And I want to let you know my pronouns are they, them. I'm the director of Fenceline Watch, an environmental justice organization based in Houston, Texas. So who are we? Environmental justice and our organization is primarily focused on the issues of fossil fuel infrastructure that we're experiencing a rapid increase of here in the Gulf Coast. We believe in a functional revolution that seeks systemic change so that we can drastically change not only the infrastructure, but the job creation of, healthy opportunities for folks who live like myself down the street from facilities that are prone to chemical disasters, that are fossil fuel generated, and that are quickly expanding. So to take a brief pause and go through some of the terms, I really want to give folks a sense of what environmental justice is. And overall, it's basically saying, let's not poison people equally. Let's stop poisoning people, period. Because environmental racism it comes out and it stems from systemic and institutional racism that is embedded within our society. So one of the most significant problems that we face in environmental justice communities is not only neglect, but also the disappearance or the ghost populations that people see us as. And it's simply because of where we live, the low resources within our own communities, within our families, within our structures, and barriers like language justice, which I'll be touching on further. I want to give you also an understanding of where I come from and what my communities look like. So overall, just this is a picture of a Texas oil field. This is the Permian Basin located in West Texas, an oil field that is quickly expanding. In fact, from 2017 to 2018, we saw a 47% increase in rig operation and activity, largely fueled by things like plastic investments and this growing need for fossil fuels to redirect its efforts into industries that have infiltrated our lives, like plastics. We see it in our clothes, we see it in our homes, it is embedded in our lives, and it is an opportunity for the fossil fuel industry to continue going even as we transition into a renewable economy. So what does that mean for people living on the ground? What do our communities have to face? These are a few images from different chemical disasters. The one at the bottom left-hand side is the ITC fire, a fire with a plume that expanded over 47 miles long, 14 miles wide. It called for an emergency response of over 300 first responders, including firefighters, hazmat, and these are all from multiple municipalities. Again, I live in Houston, which is home to the largest petrochemical complex in the entire nation, a complex that spans over 72 miles wide. So again, bringing it further down into what we have to deal with inside of our homes, looking at the family level, increased rates of asthma, upper respiratory issues, but that's not simply where it stops. And I know there is this hyper focus on upper respiratory issues, but the longer health effects that really plague our community are multi-generational harm, because we're talking about toxics that are trespassing from petrochemical facilities, oil refineries, storage containers, railroads, everything and anything you can think of has at some base to do with chemical production. And so this unnecessary consumption that we see continuously going on does have a price. And that price isn't simply what you pay at the cash register. It's a price that is laden and burdened and put on the shoulders of environmental justice and fenceline and frontline communities. So here we have an image of a family that's located just down the street from where I live, a park in our community, Hartman Park, plastic that we have to use in case there are chemical disasters, which means if you look at the bottom picture where this gentleman is simply playing baseball with his family, you can see a fugitive emission in the background. These emissions can last anywhere from a couple of minutes to hours and even days. What does that mean? It means that there is information that needs to be given to community members that isn't at the time that the incident is occurring. And so instead of taking the proper procedures and trying to take care of ourselves, folks are given misinformation or no information, which is the worst possible scenario. And so you take this risk of being outside with your family. Now I'm going to layer on another issue that we recently experienced once again here in Texas, and that's, climate change. How does that fit in? How does the growth and rise of extreme weather affect our communities? We just went through the Texas freeze, which had effects of a statewide blackout. We have been hit time and time again by hurricanes that are even harsher and more extreme. Hurricane Harvey dumped within 3 days span, it dumped an entire year's worth of rain on our community. So the picture you see at the bottom left-hand corner is a picture from a home of a gentleman that I helped gut out and take whatever remaining belongings he had. He was in a wheelchair and he lost not only his wheelchair, but he lost his entire home. And if you can see in the image, you can see how high that water level was. And fortunately, he was able to leave before being inundated by water. So this increase in climate change and extreme weather affects issues like immigration, public housing, a lack of healthcare, and a lack of enforcement and transparency on rules. When you have states that are plagued with large populations that are not covered by insurance, with public housing, folks who are displaced and public housing is completely devastated, that public housing isn't going to come back. Immigration, if you have questionable status within this country, you will not be going to FEMA and trying to get any resources in order to rebuild your home. So we see this happen time and time again. And now let's layer that on with what's going on today in the world, a global pandemic, with states like Texas lifting mask mandates and increased COVID numbers going up. This is an issue that we have seen multiple institutions bringing us information about who is impacted, how are they impacted, and the layers of issues that make these situations worse. And one of the studies, if not multiple, have already come out about disproportionate pollution adding to the aggravation of our situation. So where do we go from here? We have to start with bottom-up solutions. We have to talk to communities. And being a community member, it's frustrating to see policies and legislation move without any conversations coming to us. These are a couple of the conversations that have actually included community bottom-up efforts, everything from the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act to NEPA conversations, the protections of public participation and language justice. These are the types of solutions that people on the ground are actually mobilizing around. Why is it important? Because with every barrier that systemic racism and institutional racism poses to us, it limits not only our public participation, but information that has to come all the way down to the community level. Because as the picture that you saw a couple slides before with a gentleman playing baseball in a field as a fugitive emission is occurring, the reasons why we don't act as quickly as we have to is because of that lack of information. So with a growing population that doesn't speak English or isn't English dominant, we then begin to have disparities in information, in resources, and even what's going on the ground. Here are a couple of other policies, and I want to just touch and share these with you because community knows the policies that have touched their lives. They know the effects, and they also know the movement that needs to happen. So what needs to change? Why does it need to change? Why are the relationships important? Because community has lived experience. We are living this in our everyday lives. So everything from how many fugitive emissions, what are the smells? Are we getting the headaches? Is it just asthma? Are we experiencing vomiting? Have our community suffered from issues of sterility? You won't know that unless you begin to include community inside of your work. Terminology is so important. Because you have the power and the ability to write legislation or policy doesn't mean that that information is going to be easily translated. In fact, currently in Texas, we're seeing the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality potentially pass rules on simplifying language so that community members understand the permits that are going to affect their health. And this is not to give them a massive round of applause, but these are the things that folks consider small that do create barriers to information. On the ground experience, whether it's how does this chemical disaster, this facility affect a school that's down the way? How does it affect public parks that have to be open? How does flooding involved chemical disasters? Whether it's industrial waters being shared with a neighborhood, because in states like Texas and more realistic, Houston, have no zoning. So it is not illegal to put a petrochemical facility across the street from a school, across the street from a park, and across the street from a home. We're not talking about a barrier or buffer zone. I'm talking about a walk away. A walk to the mailbox is how close you are to one of these facilities. So what do? In order to really encourage these relationships, there have to be equitable partnerships and clear lines of communication. This need for unnecessary urgency because a policy or legislation didn't begin to have community members sit at the table until the timeline is too far is something that we need to leave in the past as we move towards a just transition and meeting the needs of community. Recommendations that I'd like to just share with you is create a scope of research with that grassroots lens. If you don't know what an MOU is, it's an agreement. Create an agreement with a community partner, whether it's a church, a civic association, or an organization like ours. Because you need those clear lines, those clear what are going to be the outcomes, and let them be realistic. The need for policy recommendations that comes and stems from the community, notification of publishing. So when you publish a study, a policy, it's important to go back to the community you extracted from so that it is building a relationship and not simply an extractive one. Funding for translation of the documents that are being produced so that community has information, because it's only then that you begin to mobilize folks. And then co-conducting research. Don't simply post a new piece of research, an article, an op-ed, but really raise up the efforts in the community that are going door to door, that are knocking on folks' door to find out that critical information you need, whether it's I'm having problems with drinking water, my water's coming out, muddy. There are more and more boil water notices in my community. What is it that you need? And with that, I'd like to wrap up and thank you for giving me the time to share from a community-based perspective here in environmental justice community in Houston, Texas. Thank you.
Sorry, the sun's coming over now just in time. Hello, guys. My name is Kayla DeVault. Bonjour, Anin. I am enrolled Shawnee and I am descended Anishinaabe. I am currently sitting on Otham lands, just north of the Gila River Indian Reservation in Phoenix. And I bring that up as land acknowledgement is something that we have been using in practice. It doesn't necessarily solve the problems, but it gives the acknowledgement of historic relationships in the spaces where we are. So I wanted to start by saying a lot of what Yvette said. I was thinking I probably going to say some similar things. That NIMBY, as they call it, not in my backyard, is definitely a big proponent in environmental racism. It's something that we see in a lot of Indigenous communities. I know they also brought up how terminology and language is isolating. I actually found that myself trying to join in the climate movement. There's a lot of words, a lot of buzzwords that can be used that not everybody can understand, and it feels a little isolating. And also validating knowledge, as they mentioned, knowledge comes in all kinds of forms. It's not just something you pay an education for. Lived experience is a really big proponent. I'm going to take a little turn and take advantage of the fact, though, that I have you guys here today listening to me to give you a rundown that I try to do in organizations that I work with, which I think is very important to understand when we're working in the climate movement. And I'm of course going to be coming from a very Indigenous perspective because I think it is absolutely pertinent to understand certain concepts in order for us to do work and engage, especially in this country, because we have so many tribes, but also around the world in general from working with Indigenous groups. So I'm going to try to do a little quick historic background. And I don't know, probably have some people that have had law classes, so you probably have heard a lot of these things. And then I want to introduce some key takeaways, including terminology that I'm sure will come up like in further discussion about these topics. But to start with, when we look at this country, it's important to realize that we presently have 574 federally recognized tribes, and about half of those are in Alaska itself, and that there are also state recognized and unrecognized tribes, and this has a special legal existence and history behind it that is important when we work in communities, especially when we work on Indigenous lands or with Indigenous communities. So to start with, let's paint a picture of what we looked like in this country before it was called a unified country. Before Columbus, there were millions of people who have been here for thousands of years. They have very specific religious beliefs, epistemologies, which center them on the land. There were thousands of languages. There were so many diverse cultures, things that maybe the stereotypes about Native American peoples wouldn't tell us about. Then we have acts like the Doctrine of Discovery and Manifest Destiny, where explorers and colonists were able to take advantage of the land. They thought it was their God-given right, and it was sort of a propaganda agenda to be able to take the land and move people away from it and to not honor promises that were made. So the US declared plenary power over trading rights with all foreign nations when they wrote the Constitution, the Commerce Clause, and that's substantial because we're talking from the founding of this country. Tribal sovereignty was written straight into the Constitution. They considered tribes foreign nations. And that's a really important distinction because it recognized them as being capable of their own leadership and having their own unification from which they functioned with all their landscapes and everything, all their languages and all of their negotiation rights. So the signing of treaties occurred during this period, and those are international law. And even though all the treaties have been broken, it doesn't mean that they do not still count. They're not abrogated. It gave absolute, exclusive, and preemptive power and sovereignty. And sovereignty is a really important thing that I'm going to be talking about quite a lot probably when I speak. But it's also important to realize how concepts of sovereignty have changed over time. And as we come into the early 1800s, we saw a removal era. We had more people pushing for more land. They wanted to come from other countries and move in. And it resulted in the breaking of treaties, the forced removal of people. We talk about Trail of Tears. There were quite a many tribes, including my own, that was actually moved 3 separate times. And so we start to see a shift under Andrew Jackson, where there were 3, they called them the trilogy cases, 3 cases that were brought down in the 1820s and the 1830s, where Chief Justice John Marshall essentially took the idea of tribal sovereignty and shifted it into a more paternalistic structure. And that is so important because that is how we exist as tribes who are sovereign and yet not completely, more at a level with the state, still subject to a lot of federal jurisdiction, but allegedly with own tribal powers, tribal governance, and nationhood, essentially. So it's a very complicated thing to navigate, especially when we talk about land and resources. Anyway, another symbolic thing of this moment is the Indian Affairs used to be housed in the Department of War, and it was shifted to the Department of the Interior. And if you've been listening about Deb Haaland possibly being put into the head of Department of the Interior, and it being significant, it is significant because it represents the land. It's also a little bit of a paradox because while it's a peaceful shift to be placed into the Department of the Interior and not Department of War, it's also symbolic of the fact the United States was essentially saying, we view you as part of our country. You're separate and distinct, but not quite. So there's some symbolism behind that that is significant. Another thing that was happening during this time is land has been used as a weapon in many ways. For example, if you couldn't properly farm, then you weren't considered being able to actually have the land. And it was used to checkerboard, as we say, on some reservations where, especially in Indian country, such as in Oklahoma, where people's land, if they were given an allotment and they didn't fulfill the duties that the government deemed appropriate, meaning farming technology, which if you know anything about sustainable agriculture and some of the issues we have today, ironically, the things that made them qualified to have the land are some of the problems we're having today with our agriculture. And so if they didn't replicate those methods, they lost the ability to have the land. They also had the boarding school era coming into the late 1800s, where the federal government specifically stated that kill the Indian and save the man. The idea being they would take children away to boarding schools and force them to cut their hair, change their religion, change their language, and all of these things to sort of strip away any kind of cultural unification that was different from the assimilated society that they were aiming to achieve. And so as we see these shifts happen, we started in the 1924, the Citizenship Act, another shift towards trying to make tribal sovereignty slightly more undermined. Now you could actually be a tribal member, a citizen of your nation, and a citizen of the United States. And some people argued, well, if we're citizens of our tribal nations, why should we be American citizens? But the government was taking a more paternalistic stance of trying to still, in a way, assimilate all of the people. But in 1928, there was a Merriam Report, which is really substantial. And the Merriam Report was actually one of the first times there was public outcry about the treatment of Native American peoples, about what was happening in the boarding schools, breakouts of diseases and things, the substandard living conditions, as they would say. And all of this was written from a lens of Western society in some capacity, but it did highlight some big mistreatment and big policy errors that were happening. And that also sort of sparked a new era where we shifted during World War II, as you know, many Native American people were being sent off to fight for the United States, coming back to a country where they still couldn't vote. We entered an era where it seemed like we were starting to get more tribal rights. And then we hit termination era, where the government just decided to stop recognizing tribes. And there are still tribes to this day that are trying to get their recognition back. And during that time, it started to coincide with the civil rights movement. And during the civil rights movement, we started to see an uptick in this idea of sovereignty, and most importantly, the self-determination era. So this era is pretty much where we are right now, where tribes are trying to restore their right to religious freedom, rights to consultation. The American Indian movement played a large role in getting national and international attention, actually. There has been more of a call towards the stereotypes and issues that keep people from authentically engaging with indigenous nations. I think largely there's a misunderstanding about the concept of sovereignty and self-determination. And even when we look at the Green New Deal and different things that have been proposed, there's an argument that when we talk about engaging with communities, we should be distinctly talking about the fact that these tribes are also very sovereign and distinct in themselves, and we have a specific negotiation process to follow when talking with them. And so I would just want to pull out a few of those key things. Of course, I just talked about sovereignty and self-determination. The idea of paradigms and epistemology is very important too, and it has to do with, you could say, cultural intelligence, or how you actually work with communities. And I believe Yvette also had mentioned too, the fact of co-creation or working with communities, or not just studying communities, but bringing the research back and putting it into the hands of the people so that they know how to empower themselves and work with them as partners and not just study subjects. Those are all really important concepts. And when you're looking at certain marginalized communities, it's always important to remember the intergenerational and historical trauma that might affect the way that they engage with us. There have been various intersections that you might have seen that infringe on sovereign tribal rights. Of course, one of the most important one is Standing Rock. And I always argue, the stereotypes make us think that that was purely about environmental movement, about water, but largely it was about treaty rights and the violation of sovereignty as well, and how to move forward from there. There are times, though, I think it's important to realize when we have problems of shutting down a lot of these resources that are being extracted, because if you realize Native American tribes today do not have nearly the same land base as they used to, of course, and about 85% of resources west of the Mississippi, I believe is the number, are actually on tribal lands. And there are many tribes that are actually using those resources. And for example, we see conflicts of environmental movement with tribal rights. When there were some freight trains that were exporting coal from the Crow Nation in Montana to export to China, might be one of the only revenues that the tribe has because of this historical framework we just discussed. However, from an environmental perspective, people want to shut that down because they want to shift from coal. So sometimes we have to think about who's on the receiving end, which is why I think it's really important to work with all communities, including those that maybe historically have become dependent on these kinds of jobs. Super funds is another really big issue. There are more super funds, I forget the exact figure, but a majority of super funds are on or very close to tribal lands. And that has to do with that environmental racism that we discussed earlier. We talked about immigration, the border wall. The border wall is another thing. It actually divides the O'odham community from the Donna O'odham to the Gila River communities to the north in the Phoenix area, and the families that are in Mexico. And so I think one of the other big things to mention is I like to call it cultural loss and damage. And the idea of cultural loss and damage is something that separates indigeneity from people that don't really identify anymore as Indigenous. It's because of that connection to land and the culture that's tied in with that land. Even language is a gateway to paradigm. If you speak another language, you know that when you're speaking that language, you sometimes just think differently. And when we lose land, when there are these communities that are literally going underwater, that they've lived there for thousands of years but no longer can live there, there is much more that is lost than just what is tangible. And culture is often so affiliated with that land and those, supposed resources. So I guess I can wrap up. My main takeaways here is just to talk about sovereignty and how that's going to fit into conversations when we're working with tribes, how to authentically engage with tribes, not just consulting with them, but also receiving consent, and how to take policies like UNDRIP and making sure that they actually have teeth and they give empowerment to these communities, how to look at solutions that revive Indigenous knowledge, and also how do we actually sometimes not just criticize the federal government for certain policies, but how do we hold tribal governments accountable as well? And everything that I'm saying today, just to clarify as well, I'm not representing my work. I'm just here as more of a research student and a past delegate for different negotiations. So thank you. I'll pass my time off now.
Thank you to both of our speakers. I think we're going to open up for question and answer. I'd like to invite you to put any questions you have in the chat, and we'd be happy to address those. And if you guys don't mind, I would like to start off. First of all, thank you for both of those great presentations. I kind of wanted to stand up and just go, yes, yes, because those are a lot of the same things that, I and others talk about daily and struggle with daily and have for years. So it's very much appreciated. You both talked about cultural competency in some capacity and the need for that, the need for respecting one's heritage and culture. And so I guess I just wanted to talk about the process for becoming culturally competent for someone outside, I guess I would say, someone not a person of color coming into a community. And I want to specifically focus it around, for example, just as an example, COVID-19 and how information was disseminated or not in a culturally relevant way. And Yvette, can I start with you?
Thank you so much, Adrienne, for asking that question. I keep coming back to language because if people cannot understand, if you cannot understand the information coming to your community, you are helpless. You have nothing to base anything on. And simply doing a direct translation, which is something we argue against time and time again, is simply not the solution, because there are words that cannot be translated or interpreted into multiple different languages. So having information, come to communities, and that information not taking into account how much of the population not only is linguistically isolated, but literacy rates that we continue to struggle with isn't taking into account how we need to receive information. And we've said time and time again, not only with COVID, but with research, is include infographics, include images, have dialogue. And at the end of the day, none of this is going to supplant having those direct conversations with community. With the advancements in technology, even this conversation we're having now opens those windows. But unless we start really taking an intentional step and saying, you know what, let's meet with the civic associations. Let's, have a virtual screening for churches, something that so many communities hold as the heart of their community. Then that outreach isn't just, we can't just assume it's going to get out there, right? Not everybody has a computer. Not everyone speaks the language. Not everyone is technically savvy. So let's have that conversation, but don't just, release those plans, release that information without coming to community and saying, hey, how can we do this in a way that's effective? Where does your community go to? Where do you see large masses of people, get together? Let's go there first, what are the institutions that people respect? Schools, how many times have we seen school flyers end up, in the hands of parents because there was just like, let's slip it in a backpack, So really respecting the community's knowledge based on that and putting in the effort and resources to get out there, because there are no shortcuts when it comes to community engagement. We know this as grassroots organizers, and that's why canvassing has been such an effective approach. The census is a beautiful way that takes on that community organizing method and puts it into action, because the census knows that they need that information in their hands in order to start reallocating funds where funds need to go.
Thank you, Yvette. Kayla, would you like to add to that?
Sure, and actually, I'll segue just a little bit into that too. And this brings up another topic in Indigenous communities. The census is really important. And one of the things that happens in Indigenous communities is concern for data sovereignty and who holds that information. But I'll circle back to that in a second. Yeah, I wanted to touch on the idea of cultural competency, and something in my training in public health I've seen it shift towards is people trying to differentiate that from cultural intelligence. And I think that does kind of come to that question of, how do you learn a culture? How do you learn to engage with the culture? And the reality is you really won't ever be competent in something that you're not a part of or haven't have that lived experience and grown up in and understand fully. And there's also similar to data sovereignty, there's also cultural knowledge that can be safeguarded sometimes, and that just you have to learn to carefully navigate through those challenges, I believe. For me, I think working with other people takes a lot of mental agility, being able to listen and respond, having self-awareness, just being present. But also, I think we get those stereotypes and microaggressions that can sometimes sneak back into our conversations as well. And we don't even realize, even if we have the best of intentions. But I think it's also important to focus in that being present about the nuances. Because, for example, in my community, you typically don't look people in the face. But if I walk into an office in a professional meeting or something, or just you guys in the camera here, sorry about the similar, that's actually considered a very aggressive thing. And so there are some communities, but doesn't mean every community is like that, because again, Indigenous Native American communities are very diverse. And that's gonna be, of course, I'm sure every community we could be talking about, not just Native American communities. Now, I think going into that, talking about COVID-19 and the disseminating of information, I think that is kind of circling back to data sovereignty and the complex with research. A lot of mistrust. I actually graduated with American Indian Studies degree from Arizona State University, which doesn't have the best track record for working with tribes. It's actually like one of the big cases, the blood work. And so I think it's twofold, because there's this thing happening, people don't really understand it and they don't really trust. There's so much mistrust of the data or who to listen to. And in the process of that, there's also this complex where Western methodologies tend to be very favored. We love quantitative research, but for example, a lot of marginalized communities, qualitative research is sometimes where you're going to get the best results. Like talking circles are a really big thing in tribal communities. And I think it's just coming at a different approach and also really validating what works for people as well. I believe that in talking about how we solve people's health, treating like the entire person, not just like the symptom or whatever, but also looking at what ways spiritually work for them. And in my work, they have increasingly been working to include more traditional avenues for people to engage in. And I think it's really important when we can incorporate that, acknowledge it and validate it, even if we don't necessarily have the quantitative scientific validation that says, oh, this method works, like it works for that person. And I think especially a lot of the systemic issues with COVID that we've seen, and this comes back to the overview I try to give, a few centuries in a few minutes, but the idea being that because these systems have developed over time, things have changed, sometimes forcibly so, behaviors have sometimes changed forcibly so, and we have to learn to navigate with the reality of the lack of infrastructure for tech access. I actually lived on the reservation for a while, and I myself had to drive an hour just to make a phone call to join an online meeting for my first time, and that was only a few years ago. And so there's a lot of, and it's not just language, but that's definitely a big proponent, especially in our elderly populations. There's a lot of different ways to speak to people that's not just lexicon. And I think we have to be creative and look at each community individually instead of trying to get blanket cookie cutter solutions, because that just never works.
Thank you.
One other thing I wanted to highlight is that, I spoke about canvassing, and there's an importance in having someone knock on your door who doesn't look like someone who oppresses you. And I say that because, the typical person who's going to canvass around and talk about environmental issues is going to be a young white person. The kind of person that we need knocking on our door, informing us about the issues, is people who can speak our language, who understand our communities. And that just raises the importance of hiring folks inside of the community and being that job creator, because people who live in the community know best where other people are, where they shouldn't go. There is an issue with stray dogs in our community. They know, how to handle those situations.
Thank you. Both of you brought up some important points. And in addition to, one of the things that I know a lot of people have been talking about is, I know for most people, most communities, including mine, you want to talk to somebody who looks like you, who understands what you're going through. And some, it's easier to open the door to, if it's a stranger, at least it's a stranger who is sort of familiar. And also you both talked about something that I truly believe in, and I know a lot of people are starting to listen, and that's around community science and the importance of that historical knowledge and information that you're not going to get in the laboratory, but you're only going to get by interacting with communities, which is why it's so important to engage early and often. And before we get to the question online, I did want to say, a lot of us have been talking about the fact that what's been going on lately with the pandemic, and even before that, listen, we've already been sort of warned about this. We should have learned our lesson from the past, and we haven't. There's a lot of talk around mitigation, addressing an issue after it happens, as opposed to adaptation, which is preparing people in advance for disasters. And so I guess I wanted to see if one or both of you could talk a little bit about the difference in responding to emergency events as opposed to long-term and recurring problems, things that we should have learned about and prepared for over time. And I'm going to start with you again, Yvette, if you don't mind.
Again, great question. We get hit with crisis a lot more often than what the news reflects. And having that connection to the community gives people an opportunity to be at the forefront of what that crisis looks like on the ground. The difference between tackling something that's long-term and crisis can be, a double-edged sword in some ways. Because if you're simply an organization, or if you're an individual who hops on like, hey, let me talk to you, I know this crisis just happened right now, and only is there to stick around to extract information. Well, I'm trying to get to my community. I'm trying to tell them to shelter in place. I'm trying to, get as many resources out. It is not the time, If you come with resources, if you come with a base of knowledge to help during those crisis modes, is going to be the most helpful to someone like me in my community. But staying for the long term and trying to really fix, whether it's making policy recommendations on the issues, because folks who have a background in policy have a better understanding of how certain systems work. And not only just, holding that within themselves, but bringing that back. I want you to have, a conversation, a workshop with my community from your mouth, talking about how that policy is going to be enacted, doing a roundtable, just like Kayla said, what could be the possible solutions in those listening sessions, and make that change really happen. Because chemical disasters, natural disasters aren't going to stop. What we can do is create systems of support that are policy backed through that policy change. But those conversations need to happen. And the same goes for folks who do the long-term, I'm working on this issue, I'm working on this policy, it's long-term, but I'm unwilling to act during crisis. I don't have the time, I don't have the capacity. And to them, I want to share, if you don't have the capacity, I, who am living through that crisis in that moment, have even less capacity. And that's where that privilege needs to be recognized, because time, just like there's a crunch on everyone, it's not only time that we're fighting for, it's our lives, it's our families, and it's our communities and our future.
Thank you, Yvette. Kayla, did you want to address this issue? Or I see a question in the chat that's directed to you, but your choice. Because eventually we'll get to the question in the chat. So, but I didn't know, I just think it's important that people recognize how important history is and how we need to learn from it,
Sorry, I'm trying to read the chat when I can. Either way, I'd like to answer both, but
okay,
whichever
please.
you think is.
No, both are just very important. So
yeah,
you need me.
Sure, well, I'll just.
Okay.
I'll finish this question off, and then you can tell me what the other question is. Yeah, so again, talking about coming to the community for answers, I think that's so important. I think power dynamics becomes like a big deal in that, because again, because we are trained as researchers, but there's not necessarily an authentic way to get answers sometimes, or like one single way. I mean, there are many approaches, many ways to engage communities and engage different kinds of people. And I also think, you know, the power dynamics can also play a role in people feeling like they don't need to answer your questions because you're not going to actually do anything with it. You're not actually going to listen to them or implement it. I think that I kind of keep thinking of like healthcare examples. You know, if you come into your provider, you might feel like you don't really get enough time with your provider. Your provider, you know, might think, well, they probably went on WebMD and came up with their own solution, not going to listen to me. So there's kind of like a toss up, a struggle of like being heard, feeling like you're being heard, feeling like you're being validated, and actually what you say is important is translated into the solutions. And I think, you know, one of the problems with crisis and response is that idea that kind of have become a country of bandaged solutions, where we don't necessarily invest in the right work, or we look at things in silos. We don't realize the holisticness of the reality of not just our society, but also the earth itself is a completely living thing. And so it's not like we want to come in and just treat things when we have a problem. But if you look at your budget, I mean, how much money do you spend on preventative care versus when you go to the ER? I mean, hopefully none of us have to really spend any money, but my point being is we don't necessarily and are told culturally that we're supposed to be spending money or spending time on these other things, because it's the same thing with infrastructure in a way. And I used to work as a civil engineer doing bridge inspections. And one of the things that I was thinking about when you're asking this question is, you know, we've got bridge rating systems that we're always doing. Infrastructure in this country is interesting how it evolved, because a lot of the roads are just wagon trails, or there used to be ways people were accessing gold during the gold rush, and then it became a paved highway at some point. And that kind of development, that pattern has not necessarily led to that wholeness of community. And so when we have our bridge rating system, we know that there are bridges that are sort of on the edge of being substandard, but sometimes we don't allocate the funds or put the importance on the need to address it. And then we'll see in the news that a disaster happened. So it's always this kind of this game of like, where do we invest the time and the money? And I think that comes down to values a lot. But yeah, I think that, sorry, the other thing I was going to mention is talking about developing things like a community. I mean, we don't have good train systems. We don't have good access for people that don't have vehicles. You see a lot of hitchhiking on the reservation that intersects with a lot of violence against women and girls, and especially in Indigenous communities that are very isolated. And when we don't have this holistic approach to building our communities, I did some studies in Indigenous housing for my thesis, where I was looking at not only Indigenous knowledge and design and approach and community building, but also looking at the way that cities work together. And like I studied the Pueblo of Acoma, their city is built, Sky City is built to be like a living organism. It functions with all of their religious activities as a community. It's functioned in what's called a solar envelope, so that one building does not overshadow the other. And at times it doesn't want to be overshadowed, so it can use that solar energy naturally. And it's funny because I've seen in recent construction or urban planning, people have talked about this idea like it's a new thing, and it's like it's thousands of years old, but we lost it when we started going very much think for yourself and just, I'm going to build a building here, and it overshadows some old beautiful historic house next door, and it changes the climate in their house. And that's just talking about urban settings. But then you look at all the ways that housing and access to healthy buildings and mold and all these issues just compound, and they affect how kids have their illnesses, if they can get health care, if they have to take care of their siblings, if they, in the reservation, a lot of times truancy happens and then they can't pay their court fees. I could go on because it is so interconnected, but I'm just going to stop it right there.
No, both of you, fantastic answers. I want to read a question from our good friends, Omega and Brenda Wilson from the West End Revitalization Association, WERA, in Mebane, North Carolina. Would Indigenous people who have stopped identifying, and you mentioned that earlier, and not on tribal land help increase population counts and political power? So what sort of role do they play in that?
There, I think I'm muted now. That's tricky because it can go both ways. If you get people self-identifying, which we see a lot of that self-identifying as being Native, whether or not they are or don't identify with it, that can lead to polls published in the paper that tell us that whatever percentage of Native people don't care about a very racist mascot on a football team. Although there are probably a lot of people that don't see it matters because they live in their community and they don't encounter that kind of racism regularly. So they're just like, oh, it's a symbol. So polls can sway things the wrong way. This is a really complicated question. It's actually something that I had in my thesis because there's a formula calculator for how they fund in HUD housing for Native American communities. But because they're treated as one population, each tribe they have to all come to consensus on the census that they're going to use to be able to determine their population numbers. And then we're entering back into that mistrust thing. So unfortunately, I think the system itself needs to change on how they're doing those sorts of counts or classification, instead of putting together all Native people as like one race or as being Alaska Native, American Indian, and Native Hawaiian. That's like the legal definition. Like finding a way to give more power. It's a treating, how would I say it? It's almost like we're still in this othering world. Like it's still like the American population and the Native American population, but you have to find a way to work into the system. Yet we're still going to treat you like you're other, even though we have that paternal power over you in a way that you don't have full sovereignty. So I think we need to see a shift where we start seeing tribal nations for the 574 plus individual cultures that they are, as enormous of a task as that sounds. But I believe that we have to do that to be able to see better outcomes. I'm not sure self-identifying would really bolster it in a good way.
Okay, wow. Thank you, Kayla. And while earlier, Yvette, you put a comment in the chat that I would hope that you would be willing to elaborate on. A lack of infrastructure investments create issues with evacuation. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I want to let people understand that the infrastructure that our fossil fuel and extractive industries function on is not new. It was not built yesterday. These industries and these facilities, even on storage containers and, on their property, love to uplift that they've been in operation for over 100 years. Texas's infrastructure started early, 1901, 1902, we started having, Spindletop and Corsicana, the oil shooting out of the derricks, right? So that infrastructure alongside it is bound to fail. And when it fails, evacuation, although people, really push against, they want to push towards shelter in place, which means there's a chemical disaster, there was an explosion, I need to close, the windows, the doors, turn off the air conditioner in a state that can get into 115, 120 degrees. That it's hot. So shutting off your air conditioner can be deadly. What do we need to do? We need to increase infrastructure investments like what Kayla was giving as examples to make sure that our communities can evacuate if they need to evacuate. And doing that in a way that's planned and slow, in a way that's conducive to traffic, is probably the best and the safest way to avoid those long-term health impacts. With the chemical disaster I talked about earlier in the presentation, that was days on end. We were sheltered in place. There was plastic covering my windows. I had to put, not toilet paper, I had to put towels that were drenched in water to try and keep the fumes out. So how deadly can a situation get, and when do we need to evacuate? A lack of investment in infrastructure will put communities and the most vulnerable and marginalized in deadly positions, all for the sake of trying to do the safest thing for their families. We currently still have a major access bridge that is completely devastated because an oil barge knocked, like literally crashed into it, followed by 8 other barges. That project isn't expected to be done by the end of this year. That's many years in the process. So how do we address these issues to make sure not only we get the communication, but that there's infrastructure that can allow for things like evacuation during hurricanes, chemical disasters, even things like freezes?
Mm-hmm. And Yvette, thank you both. And you made me think about the fire in Lake Charles, which very similar, almost exact to what you described, but also at the time of COVID, which is another challenge because you're sheltering in a place that may not have been prepared for you to stay in with COVID. And now you can't open windows and doors and you can't leave to go, to a safe place, or you may not have all of the protective equipment you need. For whatever reason, we go back to cultural competency and add that in. So you guys, very, very good points here. So, you brought up, well, I should first let me go back to the chat because I just want to talk so much about just my own and just ignore the chat. I have so many questions myself. So for communities, I guess this is can really be both of you when we talk about the pipelines or communities that are economically based in oil, or I'm going to add gas. How can you address the community being partners in moving alternatives to fossil fuels when this is the history, as Caleb talked a little bit about? And then what are some starting strategies in that regard? I think this is a question that both of you can answer. And Yvette, I'm going to start with you. I see you nodding your head like you really have something you want to say right now.
Every community is different. And that's the first thing, is that not every community is this cookie cutter situation. The reason why I say that is because you can trek into a community that is extremely rural, that is smaller. It could be part of a larger city, a community in a larger city like Baytown, Texas. It is home to the second largest refinery in the entire nation. You can go into Port Arthur, largest refinery in the entire nation. And without understanding the dynamics that the oil industry has in the community, you can get a very aggressive welcome, So you can't just walk into, you can't just walk into a community meeting in Baytown and say, we need to stop oil today, yesterday, and it needs to be gone. Because you're talking about families that have had no other option. There have been no other investments made to create the kind of jobs to offer those alternatives. So if you're trying to fight, a community member that is putting food on the table, has health care, regardless of their situation, and that has all been funded by a job as a mariner or as a refinery worker, it's not going to be welcome, and you're instantly going to isolate yourself. Versus if you go into a community understanding that, hey, I'm going into, Port Arthur's been devastated, historically Black communities, I understand a little bit of the context. Let me go in and first humble myself to the community. Just because I have, prestigious title tied to my name doesn't mean I'm an expert everywhere I go with that title. So going into a community, speaking to partners about, I understand this is currently happening, whatever issue you're working on, can you give me some context? I lack that understanding because not every community is going to be the same. And with that is, if you're trying to go in and speak about transitions and speak about alternative energies, like we do time and time again here, there's always going to be someone who has an open ear. And the folks you want to go to are going to be predominantly low income, marginalized folks that have not benefited from these systems, and they exist everywhere, whether it's a shadow community or not. So taking advantage of the fact that there's EJ Screen, and an EJ Screen gives you like even a quick snapshot. Is it perfect? No, but it gives you some context to what the community's makeup is. Is it you who should be going in there, or a Spanish speaker who should be going in there? Someone who speaks Vietnamese, what are the tools that you need? So do your homework, understand the community, even if it's a little bit, the historical context, and understanding then that not every community is going to be the same. That change, without opening those opportunities, without saying, okay, here's that alternative, here's what that alternative looks like so that you can feed your family, is so important. Because if you can't put food on the table, if you're going to strip a community of its little resources, I can tell you here, there's a back to school drive that Valero Refining holds. Is it horrible? No. When you slap logos and stickers from Valero Refining so that those kids have to go to school every single day with those logos, that's horrible. Like that's horrifying. So trying to uplift how we can maneuver. Are you bringing resources? Should there be resources? And I'm gonna tell you, that's an all the time yes. So if it
Okay.
requires a fundraiser on your end, if it requires you reaching out to funders or foundations to try and address some of the issues, is probably, in my experience, has been the best way to approach these things.
Okay, thank you, Yvette. And Kayla, I'm gonna put a little twist to it. And Yvette, this in no way, of course, we all know about you mentioned, and we already, a lot of us knew, those who work in this space, about the water issues in Texas after the the climate change issues that we saw in the last couple of weeks. So I don't want you to think that I'm ignoring that issue. I most certainly am not, but I kind of wanted Kayla to talk a little bit about the intersection between oil and gas, and maybe add a little bit in there about scarcity and water resources. And then I want to give you both one huge question where you get to really share something with the audience that you think people need to take away, other than everything you've said, something that's really urgent. So maybe you could think about that, Yvette, while Kayla answers this question.
Sure. And to just sort of close out on the topic we were talking about, yeah, it's difficult, like I mentioned, about systemic or historic shifts that are happening. When you analyze the community, looking historically, what has changed? If something has broken, when did it break and why did it break? And reviving local economies and traditional economies is like a really big conversation. A lot of Native communities, although again, jurisdiction and all these other legal things can become barriers. I think it's also important when we talk about the infrastructure, two things. Realize, first of all, even if we shift towards alternative energies, I actually started a degree looking at studying solar panels and designing them for a master's program. And it's tricky because we did a trip to Nicaragua where they were extracting gold, and we're finding out the gold was actually going to the technology that we use every day. Like there's rare earth metals that are in even solar panels, and there's some concentrated solar panels actually still use oils in them to capture the heat. So there's still impacts that we have to be aware of. Of course, not the same scale as what we're seeing. But I also think it's important to mention, yes, the workers, taking care of the workers. Myself, my one side of my family was like co-workers on the reservation. My other side of the family was co-workers and farmers in white Appalachia. And it's amazing how similar both sides of my family, some of their experiences for different reasons. But the reliance their area became on certain economies. And I think it's really important to think about the laborers, because a lot of these decision makers that are happening in these industries are the directions that corporations are going. It's not coming from these workers. And I see a lot of lack of proper training, lack of understanding, not thinking the company really cares about them, and therefore they're not going to take safety protocols very cautiously. OSHA is a big thing, and it's definitely improved over the years, but workplace safety is really difficult. And I actually used to work on oil pads, because when I first started my engineering career, I was in alternative energy, and it made a shift right about that time to natural gas. So instead of designing solar panels, I suddenly was actually designing well pads, and of course I left that to go for tribal government. But it's hard, the things that I've seen, and I don't think the mental health even of workers who I've seen some workers to take drugs and do caffeine just so they can go to their second job and not sleep at all, and they're operating heavy equipment, and it's like, what's broken here? Like, this isn't right, and they need to feed their families. Okay, but trying to shift to your question now, that's looking specifically about water. I think this is one of those things, again, that comes back to infrastructure a lot as well. And for example, I have a place in Montana where we just hit -20s, and the additional bathroom they added, one of the pipelines wasn't buried properly and it busted. So I actually had to shut my water off at my house, and hopefully fix it soon when I can find someone to look at it. But there are so many problems with our infrastructure, and so much of it's very old as well. And so when we have these climate things, these shifting climate issues happening, we're not prepared for it because it was designed 100 or 100 plus years ago for the conditions that it was in at that time. I went to my undergrad in Cleveland. They have combined sewer overflow systems that they did a big dig project to try to correct some of it. But that basically means if you get too much rainwater, it's going to flow and get sewage contamination and your outflows and everything else because of the way that they channel the black waters and gray waters. And the problem is, again, as we're expanding communities, we're having this urban sprawl and we're kind of having dilapidated areas in the process and just kind of ongoing problem. We're still using the old infrastructure and we're increasing all of this materials that we're using. And there's a lot of really nasty stuff in concrete too. But that increases the velocity and quantity of all the rain runoff that's going into the systems. And that's something that you don't necessarily think about when you're like, oh, we can finally get our dirt road paved. Well, now you're going to have all this extra water dumping into the system. So they were having failures while I was in college there with all the road chemicals and everything that was getting thermal pollution also into Lake Erie and different things that were happening. And it's all interconnected. And I think too about a lot of the communities, like I did a coral reef study, all of our farming, the way that system's been built, all of the discharge that's coming from fertilizers, and that's impacting in ways you couldn't have imagined with all the coral bleaching, algae blooms that are blocking the sunlight for organisms that even the parrotfish depend on the coral reefs to live in. And I think that was the moment that I realized how much this is all really becoming a problem. When you look at one of the oldest systems in the world and you realize since the Industrial Revolution, so much of it has died in just my lifetime when it's existed for so long. And I definitely think this is a challenge in tribal communities because they have to fight constantly for their legal rights to the water. And they call it paper money. Like on paper, they have the water, but it never actually goes there. We have, here in Phoenix, people will put in golf courses, but there's a family somewhere north of here that they can't access their water because either it's being diverted to make the city a city as part of the Bureau of Reclamation's basically agenda to make uninhabitable cities habitable by siphoning the water down here. And on top of that, they have uranium mines. I couldn't drink the water when I lived on the reservation because there's contamination. And they would always say, if you ever see a yellow rock on the road, just don't touch it because it's uranium. So no yellow rocks, but people have to haul their water. Not everybody has cars. A lot of people have livestock. There definitely are a lot of intersections, a lot of use and contamination of water, of course, and a lot of questions. A lot of research about fracking, for example, and there are companies that will pay the researchers to tell you that it's not a problem, and then you have research that says it is a problem, and then we come back to this mistrust of information, and it's cyclical.
Okay, thank you. Wow. So we are coming up on time, but I've got to ask this final question. But first of all, I just want to thank you both for these thought-provoking and just important issues. And I know that the breakout sessions are going to be phenomenal. And I'm sorry I didn't get to say, please feel free to answer questions in the chat. I saw that Yvette did do that initially, and I think that the questions will be provided. But quickly, if the Biden administration reached out to you right today and said, what's the #1 urgent action we need to take right now for the community, what would you say? And I'll start with Yvette.
Cost analysis for cumulative impacts. The Biden administration needs to take into account how dangerous facilities are, even especially during times of COVID when pollution exacerbates the pandemic. So I would say do a cost analysis. How much does it cost for municipalities, first responders, for people missing work? Include that information. Emergency room visits and a lack of health insurance. We need a cost analysis because the industry can say we created X amount of jobs and created X amount of revenue. And what they're not saying is now subtract the millions of dollars that it cost the municipalities that we were in to address the chemical disasters when they happened, and let alone the health impacts of people who then have to bear the fire I mentioned earlier. The county let us know it's going to be 10 years until we see the effects of that toxic exposure actually start to bubble up to the surface. And that means everything from sterility to increased investment in, special education programs, increased investment in, in insurance, public, affordable insurance. So that's what I would say.
Thank you, Yvette. Thank you. Kayla.
I probably would first be like, why are you calling me and how'd you get my number? I think it all comes down to, I know I love the phrase, and I heard this when I went to COP about systems change, not climate change. Unfortunately, that's not a very pointed answer either, because that's an overhaul of a lot of things, from talking about restorative justice and mental health and holistic healing. Like there are so many things that you could look at. Another thing I like to think too is sometimes when you see a problem, I think you want to look at what you think is the problem, but it actually might be right next to it. And I think sometimes looking at the whole picture is very important. I believe overhauling education also to understand the historic consequences of how this country's been founded, populations, and what that means and how that translates and how people are impacted. I don't think that's talked about enough, because I don't really think it jives with the government kind of talking about what it's done. It's sort of a difficult conversation, but it needs to happen. And I think that this authentic engagement, like looking at your key informants, actually bringing people to the table, and that includes tribal nations, not just lip service. I feel, unfortunately, that there has been too much of that, even with the Obama administration. I got to go to a White House tribal youth gathering, but I don't really know what actually happened from it, or if it was just, a PR kind of a thing. And so in short, I don't think we need any more bandages. I think that we have to do the hard work of overhauling the whole system. And because, talking about legal rights in nature, Earth, it works like a living body, and it deserves to have the rights that we deserve to have too. And not just our rights to access it, but its right to be in its own existence.
Excellent. Thank you both so much. This wonderful, wonderful panel. And I'm turning it over to you, Rakhi.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hollis, and thank you, panelists. This was a wonderful opportunity to explore some really critically important issues. And it's given us all a lot to think about and a lot to discuss. Quickly, I wanted to remind you that now is the time for us to each have a break. So I'm going to ask all of you to take a break now till 3 p.m. This is a great time to turn off your camera and turn off your mics, and just return to us at 3 p.m. And we will at that point be working on the breakout room portion of our symposium. So look forward to seeing you at 3. Have a good break.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back from the break. Thank you for sticking around and being here for the breakout room portion of today's discussion. Before I begin, I just want to say thank you again to the speakers today. And I hope that I have at least one of you in my breakout room, because I know I have a ton of questions. My name is Nasia Dodson. I'm a 2L at Howard University School of Law, and I'm one of 3 moderators for our breakout room discussions today. Myself, along with Alex and Michelle, are going to be guiding what are hopefully really robust and thoughtful conversations about the information that we've learned today. I think Claire dropped some of the discussion questions in the chat already, so those are definitely topical themes that we'll be going over, but also feel free to speak up about questions that you had that haven't been answered yet in the last Q&A session, or just things that you're walking away from today's events feeling or carrying with you, or that you're excited to share with someone else. So yeah, I will yield, and I'll see some of you soon in the breakout. And afterwards, we'll be coming back and having a large group discussion. So I'll see you all then. Hello and welcome back, everyone. Thank you for continuing to stick around and for participating in the breakout room sessions. I hope they all went well. I think mine was pretty awesome. I don't want to brag, but I loved my breakout room. So we are going to begin a discussion amongst the breakout room moderators and our panelists for today, and just go over some of the thematic questions that we posed. So I'm going to check in with the other moderators quickly and ask if they had any initial thoughts or questions or reactions that they'd like to begin with.
Who should go first? I don't mind either way. I can just go ahead. So I know, Nasia, that you said you enjoyed your breakout room. You know, I gotta say my breakout room might have been even better. We had a great conversation and a lot of things. Just before we got to the initial questions, just some interesting things we talked about were we really liked how the panelists had an emphasis on language and breaking down language barriers to make sure that we can all, you know, understand the problems and come together. So my group really wanted to thank the panelists for having a focus on language. And we also really appreciated the historical context that was given to a lot of the issues here, because we felt like a lot of historical context really changes how you view a situation, really puts you in the perspective of, okay, well, this is how it was originally, this is where it is now. It gives you the full picture. And I guess for me personally, I mentioned this to my group, Yvette, when you were speaking about everything and the poor infrastructure of everything in Houston. I grew up in the Houston area. I'm born and raised in the Houston area. And I'm in DC now, but a few weeks ago, I was back at home during this winter storm. And my family, we didn't lose power, but we had pipes burst and it was just like a really stressful time. And my older sister, who lives downtown Houston, she lost power. The downtown area in the fourth largest city in America, losing power. And it really realizes that these problems are at our doorstep at the forefront. And thinking about it from, a multi-layered perspective, including the things of the pandemic and racial injustice, really, it was really hit home for me personally. So I personally wanted to thank you for that. But yeah, that's what we talked about before we got to the questions in my group, the best one.
I don't know. We had a pretty great group as well. And it was, just great conversation. And thank you, Yvette, so much for, sharing your wisdom and your experience with communities. Because that was really kind of the focus of our conversation. Really shifting towards community narrative. And, one of the first things that we discussed was kind of moving away from just, doing white paper, just putting information out there, and instead really getting to the point of actually having solutions. And, some of the themes that came up was actually communicating with people. We acknowledge that, yes, that is a challenge during COVID-19. But once we move beyond that, not just to rely on technology, not just to rely on putting out information, but actually connecting with communities face to face. One of the, first topics that came up, right, when we really look at, at meetings, actually bringing those meetings to the communities themselves and not expecting community members to leave those communities. And, that does two things. Number one, that reduces issues of access, right? Because it's a huge burden for travel, but also it shifts, right? The person who is initiating that meeting, whether it be a government entity, right? Whether it be a university, but it allows them to see what is actually going on in that community firsthand. And if we are to actually move towards a point of solution, we can't just be in a situation where we're addressing things in the abstract and realizing that these issues are impacting real people. So that we went through a lot of different themes, but that's kind of all the center of what we were talking about, and how environmental justice is not just a limitation. It's, yes, we're looking at disproportionate burdens, disproportionate impacts, but really it's broader than that. We're all ultimately impacted by environmental justice issues, and how to make people realize that firsthand by connecting with those communities that are disproportionately impacted by these issues.
Absolutely. And I'll just share quickly, because I do have a question that I would love to pose to our panelists about this. But in the beginning, people from the breakout room that I participated in, absolutely, the first thing that we spoke about was what are some things that just stood out to you from this presentation? Maybe you work in a field and you learned something about the field that you work in that you were kind of taken aback by, or something that changed your perspective or understanding of something in the justice or environmental justice related context. And there were definitely reactions to arguments in favor of qualitative studies on point here. Definitely about learning community differences. We got a lot of reactions to the point about making sure that the person that's knocking on your door doesn't mirror or resemble a group of people who have historically been oppressing you. And so we got on the topic of, I think, relearning or reimagining what effective advocacy looks like, and having to take a step back and really do or ask yourself analytical questions about, you know, regardless of what my interest is, am I serving this community, my community, a community in the best way possible? So I would like to ask the panelists, I think just taking into account everything that we've learned from the both of you today, and thank you again, what are, or if there was one thing that you could advise someone or say, this is how you become a better advocate, this is how you engage a community, this is how you listen, whether it's humbling yourself, whether it's passive like action and active listening. I think, what are ways that we can leave this today and be better advocates? Because I think a lot of our definitions are different now after listening to everything that you've both said.
I guess I can start just because also this did come up in our group a little bit, and I think what they sort of said was a pretty good response to it. I know I even wrote down somebody making a comment about you know, not being continuing enthusiasm sometimes that you want to solve the problem. And I think a lot of times with working with communities, especially like people, we did discuss, if you go and get a degree in something, you're studying the people and whatever, and like you have to make sure you give back to the community, but also realizing in doing that, you don't have to be the person that does that. It's just that you have a privilege of having studied certain ways that you can do it, because some people don't know who to ask for help, but they don't need to be told that they have what problems they have because they live with those problems. It's more listening to them, and then, as our group mentioned, trying to identify people that's in their own community, like what work can they do, what people can you work with that's already in that community. And I think it's really just that, as I mentioned before too, that power dynamics thing. So but realizing like, yeah, just because you have a degree doesn't mean you're going to know everything, because they're the ones that live it, and they're going to have things that you probably never even thought of as solutions, but you might be able to translate what they said into actual oh my gosh, I can't think of the word I'm trying to say. I use it all the time. Actual, like, making it happen. So
Yeah, I think that that's invaluable. I'd say that, you know, a huge barrier for our community sometimes is education. And, you know, the ability to pay for a very pristine education is difficult. I'm sure, you know, a lot of the students and folks here are still paying off debts and things like that. But having the time to take to stop and, you know, break that information out of that, you know, ivory tower it's sitting in, and handing it over to the community can even be more powerful. I've had attorneys teach me how to do everything from file a public comment to file a nuisance order. And that's something that I continue to use. And I just like am able to incorporate into my workshops. So don't feel like Kayla said that you have to do it every single time. But if you give me the tools to do it, whether it's a toolkit that shows me, that explains in simple language how to go from X, Y, and Z, you know, I will continue to use that. But if you hold that, you know, to your individual self and assume you're the only one who can do it, it's really limiting to the kind of progress that we can see in the community. So make yourself available. I'll call attorneys all the time and ask what I consider stupid questions that aren't, because they're attached to my livelihood. But, you know, I'll call somebody and say, what does this word mean? What is this, you know, this legislation came out from your institution. Can you explain it to me just like 5 5 minutes. I'll call somebody. I've called attorneys during chemical disasters and say, who do you think I need to contact? Because I don't have all the answers. No one person has all the answers. But I said this earlier, if I'm in a crisis, my head is trying to survive. And if I can tap somebody else in to help me out in that moment, I'll do that. And so making yourself available sometimes is the best way to be not only like a co-conspirator in our liberation, right? But be a resource and be a friend. I really wish that advocates, attorneys, and folks like that would stop seeing me as like a case number, a subject matter, and see me as the person that I am too.
You know, and if you guys don't mind me jumping in, you know, our group definitely talked about pretty much that goes to that question as well, Nasia, as in what, you know, can we do research wise and just skill set wise to affect these issues? So Rachel Landum in my group mentioned the importance of using qualitative research, quantitative research, along with the historical context and working with community, which was mentioned by Valerie Ann Johnson in our group. Mentioned that as well, like using all these different aspects of your personal skill set, coming in and building relationships with people that are in your community and the community that you're researching. It's just going to help things go more smoothly. And that's kind of, you know, what we landed on is that's kind of the ideal way that community outreach and working within a community should work. So that's one thing that we said. And then someone else in my group, Margaret Herman, she asked, we know, what can we do? She said, what is someone from North Carolina, what can we do? And one response that we had from Valerie Rangel, we had two Valeries in my group, so that's how you know we're the best. She mentioned donating. And one place that she mentioned donating to was digdeep.org. And I'm actually going to type it in the chat for everyone to see. But yeah, our group was talking about something very similar as well.
Yeah, definitely. And one thing that I did want to pull out that kind of came up in our group, Yvette, and you really shared this really detailed journey of actually taking on the perspective of the most vulnerable in our society and really seeing the barriers that they face firsthand. Would you be willing to kind of share with us more about that and how we can initiate that sort of action by policymakers and, you know, as it was mentioned, you know, kind of researchers to really value even what you detailed went beyond, you know, just getting a narrative, really understanding step by step the barriers, you know, individuals face. Would you mind sharing with us what you discussed in our group?
Yeah, I took the COVID situation where there were testing sites that were placed in, you know, different, very far apart places. And so I went from a community bus stop near the park and walked, just like didn't take the bus, just walked to see where the sidewalk ends, you know, was chased by dogs to see, you know, what are the problems that are keeping a community member from going to a testing site and even finding out that you have COVID. And I took that walk after the time that people assume folks get off of work. It took me about 2.5 hours to get to the closest testing site. I had to run across busy highways to get to a testing site. And it all informed the county health department that, hey, they need mobile sites in places. They need to circulate those resources in other places. And so that's something that policymakers can do, you know, experience what it means to not have access to certain things. And even if that gets to, if you're doing policy work in a specific community, time and time again, Union of Concerned Scientists held, you know, a listening session and the community said, live in the community. I want you to come into my community. I want you to, you know, not stay at a fancy hotel, you know, 16 miles away from the sites, but really experience what's going on here. So it's just, how do I remove that privilege, even if it's for a temporary amount of time, to see those barriers?
Yes. And Kayla, I was curious, what does that look like for you?
I think it's very complicated when it comes to policy, and I guess I'll bring up a point to well, 2 points. One is, a lot of tribes have their own entities, and sometimes it's strange because the EPA has a lot of jurisdiction over the tribes, but tribes might actually have an EPA office themselves that you have to consult to go through, tarot and different things that they have going on. But one of the things we talked about a little bit in our breakout group too is when we make solutions that affect all of the United States, for example, through like federal executive orders or other things, we have to take into consideration that can look as a slight on tribes at times, like an infringement on their own sovereignty, because executive orders will affect how they do their own business. And it's basically saying, whatever policies you have in place, we trump you. And we saw this issue with the Superfund sites, for example, in my community in Cass Lake, where we had actually like a whole research thing on this, basically a food sovereignty topic, where we've got a Superfund site that's leaching into a lake, and manum is one of our traditional foods, which grows in those areas, and it's completely affected by the waterways. But this pollution had gone into the waterways, the soils, the air. To this day, it is not cleaned up, even though it's been on the books, pretty much since the EPA started passing all these regulations. And I know that's relatively recent if we look at it, but the thing is, the tribe actually went and said, we're going to have our own policies and our own regulations for how we clean us up, and we don't want dioxin levels to exceed this certain number. And that certain number happened to be like a 3 times safer number than like the state of Minnesota or the federal government. And part of that battle is they're like, well, we're not going to pay that much money to clean it up that much because our policy says this. So it's just sitting there because everybody's arguing. So it's not an easy answer, because every tribe has their own communities and their own offices and their own ways of doing things, their own values, and some people don't have any of it. But I think it's really important when you're looking at policies, it's looking at how it's impacting every kind of the populations, all the jurisdictions, and also how can you collaborate with the groups that already exist there and make sure that what they've decided for themselves is also being upheld. And I think the Clean Air Act was an example of a way that the Navajo Nation actually got very bitter about that, because it would impact their coal plants, even though you've got the grassroots environmental justice communities that are very, we don't want the coal plants, but then we're coming back into that economics things and jobs and accessibility to jobs, and it gets complicated, but yeah.
I'd like to add something about Texas's mask orders. Or lifting the mask orders. And that shows our governor's point of privilege, because whenever you walk into a corner store or restaurant, one of the first signs you see is no shoes, no shirt, no service. And that is a policy specifically against homeless populations. So the fact that folks who don't want to wear masks are now, confronted with wear a mask, but for public safety, versus this like the unhoused situation, really shows how these issues are bubbling up. So I just wanted to echo that, because it's something that, working not only with EJ populations, but trying to address issues of the unhoused has come up.
Well, another theme that came up in our group that, I thought was significant, and Kayla, in your presentation, you touched on this as well. So I would definitely want to hear, kind of your take on things also. But we were really kind of talking about the erosion of the community right to know, and kind of the lack of knowledge, lack of information that is being shared with data, and how we've kind of seen a progression of a reduction of that information kind of from 9/11, and then even more today, and even more with the Trump administration. So I would greatly appreciate if, both, Yvette, you shared a lot during the group that was just really very thought-provoking. And, Kayla, if you're able to also add to that, I think that would be very valuable.
Sure,
Yeah, sure. Sorry. I'm
Go
actually
ahead, Kayla.
to leave right now, so I just had to transfer to the car. I'm not driving, don't worry. Yeah, so I think it's really hard. I mean, coming back from this, and I from when it comes to community events in tribal communities, if you're living on the reservation and about something happening, maybe it's even like the tribe something, there's sort of an added, what's the point of going to this? Because nothing's going to come out of this. I hear that a lot. There's basically, I'll stop my video. There's basically a mistrust in the own system sometimes that communities have in place. And some of that could be also related to, I mentioned in our group, the Indian Reorganization Act is where the government actually encouraged that tribes reorganize. And then some tribes have been finding that constitutionalizing of their tribes has actually kind of broken a system that had worked for them for a long time. So there's, and again, each community is separate, but that has been, I think, something that's been troublesome, eliminating and discussing some information. But then also, I think if there's a meeting going on with the health clinic, I mean, that's something we talk about a lot. How do we, or like COVID-19 vaccine information and communities being afraid, yet again, another medical experiment or something coming into the community. I think it's very challenging to find ways out information that you have to look at the, literacy, health literacy of the people, or how to even
Okay, it looks like we lost you for a moment.
Might have lost connection real quick.
And Yvette, I saw that you had unmuted your microphone.
Yeah. Okay, so with post 9/11, what happened to information was it got restricted. We all know what happened with the Patriot Act and privacy. That same issue with privacy occurred with information. And so issues and information that wasn't delegated to Homeland Security now became an issue for Homeland Security. So we see time and time again, the oil and gas and petrochemical industry using terrorism as a way to continue shielding information from the general public. And this includes, why is it that I don't know or can't know what the facility that I live right next to is producing, is emitting, how much it's holding? And the conversation keeps on shifting back to, well, for national safety. For national safety, you shouldn't have a home, a school, a park next to a petrochemical, oil and gas facility, any of that. If a child can walk up to a railroad, like a train car, and touch it with their hands, where is that? Where's that conversation? And it's not happening because ultimately it isn't about national security. I don't see, 102 different cameras pointed at these facilities. They're pointed at the community. And they're pointed at the community because they're trying to further understand how they can continue to take up pieces of our community. We're not given the information because if we did have the information, we would challenge the expansion of a facility. If we had the information over the toxics that we're being exposed to, we would be moved even further. If we had information on the impacts that it has to someone who is carrying a child, an unborn child, that would create public outrage, and it's not there. And we saw that happen with the tobacco industry. And it was a way to make sure that their industry is safe from, and I'm not even saying from lawsuits, from their public image. Because if the public image of oil and gas and petrochemicals is challenged, then it challenges the narrative that it's necessary to our survival that we have them, because then we're literally putting our survival in the line of danger. So a lawyer, what I had started off that conversation with was, we think we have all the information, or we think we don't need more information because we don't know the information we don't know. And we don't even have access to it. And if that access is there, it's limited. In order for me to find out if I live within a blast radius of Valero Refining, LyondellBasell, or Texas Petrochemical that I all live down the street from, I have to go and travel to Dallas, Texas with a state issued ID. And I can only take out 6 to 10 documents at a time. I know I live within the 5-mile blast radius. I know that if something ever were to happen to that facility, just like it did in Texas City, my life would be no more, that would be it. And if that information is shielded, then what was the purpose of even creating those blast radiuses to begin with, if the public doesn't know that they live in the line of danger? So a lack of information is something that has to be addressed, whether it's this administration or going forth, because the general public does not know thousands and thousands of chemicals go through TSCA review, and yet the EPA only looks at a little over 300. The toxic release inventory only looks at a little under 300, you know? So when are we finally going to get the information that we need in order to make the decisions that we need for our personal and our family and our community safety? We need to have that conversation. We need to push that buck, and we need solutions now.
No, I completely agree. And our group was talking about pretty much the same thing. And we were saying how, you know, the lack of equity in this country and I was trying to mince my words in the group, but the lack of equity in our country and just the way we value lining the pockets of people that don't care about people within these communities is not really shocking to me anymore at this point. And I just think it's important that we continue to make our voices heard, and the fact that we're talking about you know, the real issues. You know, everyone on this call is going to take what we hear today, tell someone else, and really build awareness. And hopefully by making our voices heard, we can actually get some changes done. And I've just been looking in the chat as well. You know, I feel like there's been a lot of great conversations going on there too. So it's been a great conversation.
Thank you, Yvette, for that response. And I will say, in recognizing your call for solutions, we did speak a little bit in our group about, I think in discussing the second question about the viability of community-directed policies and executive orders, and whether or not there was a general optimism or pessimism regarding hard law and environmental justice. And I believe it was Reich Longest who was saying, you know, we have Title VI as a protection. We have the court case Sandoval as a protection. We have the Civil Rights Act of 1964 as a protection, but a lot of the flaws are in implementation. And he offered that executive orders, where by and large our group was looking at them as kind of as attempts, but not necessarily successful measures of achieving environmental justice. Reich was saying that they would be useful if they could give community members a seat at the table using executive orders. So I would love to, oh, and Kayla is back as well, awesome. I would love to hear either of your perspectives of what a solution, I know that's probably such a heavy and weighty and lofty question, but what a solution starts to look like. If a solution is addressing general distrust of government, if a solution is community engagement and participation in education, if a solution is, you know, collective policy writing at a community level, I think my group would be especially interested to know what you all thought solutions to environmental justice issues start to look like.
Since we just got Kayla back, I'd love for Kayla to be able to chime in.
Yeah, sure. Sorry about the internet instability. I mean, as we were talking to, I was kind of thinking of another example of like the Navajo coal miners, them being sent in first after they would explode some of the coal down, and all the people that have diseases because of that black lung and things, and they just didn't know. They didn't know why they were being sent in before the other workers. They didn't know, had no idea that it was dangerous, but they were sort of like guinea pigs for, you know, the worst labor. And I think there's a lot of just animosity around that for a million reasons, but also because accountability is such a factor. And when there's that lack of accountability, it really perpetuates that mistrust. And I think I wish I had every answer because I don't really know what the best answer is. But I think if there's a way to actually have that accountability, and if people see it, something's working, I think that's one step in the right direction to getting, these issues resolved in a lot of ways. Of course, that's a whole gamut of different kinds of issues that could be. But I think, and we mentioned this too in the group, like a lot of consultants, for example, they do a project, maybe they need to get an environmental permit. Well, it might be cheaper for them to just violate environmental law than it is for them to go through the process of hiring people to do the permits and to make sure that they stay in compliance and inspections and all of that. And so I think that speaks to an accountability issue. And I think when it comes to tribal lands, that's an accountability issue and an internal issue too. Having myself try to phone tribal police once when I actually was almost abducted, and police never even took my name and no one showed up. And to me, I will never probably call that line again. I can't even trust the system that's in place. So that's be my input on that.
With executive orders and things that the president can and has already done, there's some value in recognizing the problem for us. People didn't start talking about environmental justice until the first executive order was signed. It didn't, unfortunately, in a system where we face institutional and systemic racism, we need someone like the president to say those words. We need him to publish and put it in White House memos as many times as possible, because at the end of the day, it gives us a historical context to what some of the solutions were. I mean, there was a lot in the executive order, and to the person who contributed and said, hey, it's just an executive order, it can't do much. That's 100% true. But for us who are here on the ground, at the end of the day, we can hold up something that says there was an executive order to do this, even if it's just for the simple fact of legitimacy, which is what communities that are marginalized and systemically oppressed continue to face. How do we gain legitimacy without having a doctorate, without having a degree, without having career experience, without coming from DC? And unfortunately, and fortunately, that's one way to do it. I mean, the president can definitely take this a lot further and the conversations further, but even the steps, even the fact sheet that points out everything that the EO does is inherently important, and we have to value that in some sort of way. We can go a lot further. The fact that it doesn't call for a pause of oil and gas leasing until we get cumulative analysis about the impacts of extractive industry was something that was striking to me, because it uplifted a problem. The executive order uplifted a problem that traditional conservation efforts have said, which is we want the protection of offshore, of these specific species in the water, which I'm not saying that they're less important than a human life, but the human cost wasn't brought into it. The fact that it was like, let's talk about public lands and ceasing that activity on public lands doesn't address my community. It doesn't address the Huma Nation down in southern Louisiana that got displaced because literally the water, coastal erosion, the water is rising. It doesn't address our issues. And the simple fact that offshore oil leasing, we can't make a claim that we will be hurt by offshore oil lease activity. When BP hit, it affected fisherfolk communities. It affected indigenous communities. It affected folks who were involved in the cleanup, using prisoners to clean up tar balls along, the ocean front. Everything was affected. We continue to consume fish that were being fished out of these waters. So where were the protections there? I would like for the administration to take that extra step and say, you know what, we also need to look at ceasing or pausing oil and gas activity and look at the harm that it's creating in communities. Because if the thought process is, well, I'm going to write this and it's going to look good and communities can hold on to it, give me something that my community can hold on to a little longer. This administration has taken an overly friendly approach to natural gas. It has taken an overly friendly approach to nuclear activity, and I haven't seen that conversation come out of anything like the executive order. So is there a lot more work that can be done? All the time? But what I can say is we're not under Trump. We're not under the continuous rollbacks. So if we can get back to a point where we're not continuing to fight the rollbacks, we are still suffering under the Trump administration, we are at a loss because we have nothing to put these down to. And the other last thing I'd add to that is, you're right, we do have Title VI. In fact, I co-wrote a Title VI to address language justice here in the state of Texas. And I can tell you the Title VI was taken up. The DOJ said yes. EPA went after the state of Texas for language access. And now we're in a process where as of March 10th, they will have to release language that was shared with the EPA in order to address the language access issues, because prior to, you had to have a state issued ID in order to even understand, in order to gain the translation equipment if we were able to fight for it. People weren't given the information to even attend the meetings. I could translate as much information as I wanted to, and then have community members who speak Spanish there to testify about their children with nosebleeds to the industry who's causing it. And they didn't, English was the only language that was provided by Valero Refining in order to convey, hey, we're trying to get this permit. And so this Spanish speaking mom who had children with consistent nosebleeds couldn't understand, hey, this project is coming whether you like it or not. She could share what she was saying. It's the same issue we have in the EPA though. An EPA translator is only dedicated for a certain amount of time. And none of the information coming from the EPA hearing has to be translated. Why? Like, we're not even talking about Texas. We're talking about the federal government. So if we want to go through and we want to talk about Title VI, let's talk about Title VI at the federal level, not just the state level. Let's talk about why cases have been on the books for 10 years plus and have gotten no remediation. And that's through the Title VI process, because there are no deadlines. There's nothing to say the issue has to be addressed within a 5-year span. And let's re-engage the Voter Rights Act that gave us a formula to point the finger and say, these districts have been historically disadvantaged, because this administration needs to put that in full effect. 2021 will be the first year that the state of Texas has districting or redistricting that didn't have to have pre-clearance by the DOJ. What is that going to do to us in the next election cycle? Our districts will be redrawn in a way where there isn't even a sliver of hope for us to get Governor Greg Abbott out or try to re-elect a more progressive president. So let's solve those situations. Let's really get our hands in the dirt and not just stop at writing an executive order, but reestablish systems that were able to identify systemic and institutional racism.
Thank you so much. I'd like to ask all of us who are here today to join me in a virtual round of applause for our moderators and our speakers ending on such a strong note. Please join me if you wouldn't mind. This has been an outstanding afternoon, and I thank you all as participants for joining us. I really think that we had engaging conversations in our breakout sessions. We made new connections, and we got exposed to much new information and many new ideas. I also wanted to acknowledge the contributions of the organizing institutions, specifically Howard Law School, the Duke Environmental Law and Policy Clinic, the Vermont Law School, Shaw University, and the Yale School of Forestry and the Environment. Our vision in doing this work was to try and forge collaborative partnerships between institutions that could last beyond just this one set of symposia. And we have one more in the series. I wanted to remind you that next Saturday, March 13th, the symposium will be Back to the Future, America's Youth Organizing for Environmental Justice. So we will be focusing that session a lot on talking about how we engage youth activism to helping to correct the injustices that some of which we discussed today and more of which we'll discuss next week. Lastly, I'd like to most importantly thank our speakers. Kayla and Yvette did a wonderful, wonderful job introducing us to new situations, to new ways of thinking, and to new ways of approaching problems that they have confronted in their communities, and are true examples of community heroes who are working with and along with others to make a difference in this world. So thank you so much for your contribution today. Lastly, I wanted to remind you that any of you who are interested in finding out more about these events or future programming, please make sure to use social media to follow the Duke Environmental Law and Policy Clinic. We will be endeavoring to ourselves shine a spotlight on information from communities and regarding these topics as we go forward. So I want to thank you so much. And the mics and cameras for some of you might still be on. We will be closing this session, and I will thank you and look forward to speaking with you again at another one of these symposia. Thank you so much.